who we are to us and as a country for many, many years. It's fantastic that he's come all of this way. He's told me, however, and normally I would be quite happy to tell you that he's a St Kilda supporter, but as a Docker supporter, I think we're actually getting worse this year. So, but he is a St Kilda supporter, but notwithstanding that, very, very welcome, and we really look forward to your presentation. Please welcome Bernard.
Thanks very much, Sue, for that introduction, and thank you also to the Chamber, to the Council and others who have sponsored me to come here today. Bernard Zolt, partner with KPMG based in Melbourne. My presentation today has the very dull title of Demographic Outlook for Kalgoorlie Boulder. I hope it's not dull, but I do think that you can assess where a city, where a region, where a country has been by looking at the big picture demographics. And by projecting that forward, you can see the parameters, the constraints that will shape that city, that region, that country going forward. I have a very simple proposition, and that proposition is that Kalgoorlie Boulder is a city, a region that punches well above its weight. I made this point last night. It may only be a city of 33,000 people or so, but it controls a vast and iconic proportion of the Australian continent. These facts will not change over the course of a generation. And for that reason, I think that the ambitions, the sights of this community should be set very, very high. I don't think we should accept just merely punching above our weight. We should expect to punch above our weight in this community. Let's start by taking a big picture perspective and ask, what has the Australian nation done with the Australian continent in the last quarter of a century? In this map, I've identified areas of extreme population growth and extreme population loss between 1992 and 2015. Was that 23 years or so? There are 78 red bits on this map. These are places where there has been population loss every year for 23 consecutive years and possibly longer. As a nation and as a generation, we are saying we don't live in the red bits, we live in the blue bits. And the blue bits of substance are on the coast. This, of course, is the great sea change and tree change shift. Up and down the eastern seaboard, the outer suburbs of our largest capital cities. A number of mining communities, of course, very small population bases, but even in Perth, up the coast or down the coast. You can even go to Tasmania, and it is also that coastal push, if you like. The only blue bits of any substance, this one is actually, that's actually a chuka on the Murray. In fact, people get very excited about this area around here. It is not, in fact, the Woomera Detention Centre. It is, in fact, a reorganisation of the Indigenous community, in fact. The total number of people living in that red blue bit there is 170. In 1992, it was 50. So vast tracts of the Australian continent, very, very lightly populated. The red bit in the middle of the blue bit in outback South Australia is in fact the Maralinga nuclear testing site from the 1950s. But you can actually see Kalgoorlie at this big picture perspective. Yes, the population might be settling over the last 2 or 3 years, but if you look back over the last 20 years, in fact Kalgoorlie Boulder and the immediate surrounds have actually been increasing. This is the Great Western Wheat Belt, of course. I was in Merredin, in fact, in 2013, looking at the population of the wheat belt. The Australian agricultural output is far greater today than it was 10 years, let alone 20 years ago. We are very efficient at producing agricultural product. We simply do not need the labour in these communities that we did 20 years ago, let alone in our parents' era. And all that population then bleeds off into big capital cities or big regional centres. And Kalgoorlie might be an example of that. How does this compare? Is this good? Is it bad? Is it unusual? Is it globally significant? Is the interior of the Australian continent behaving differently to, say, mainland America? Let's have a look at the same chart, the same map, the same time frame, the same calibrations for the 3,000 counties of mainland America. Same red bits, blue bits. This is what America looks like if you compare it like for like year for year with Australia. And in fact, it's about the same distance from left to right, but of course 3,000 counties. And of course the geography is fundamentally different. You have the Mississippi River going right down the middle here, which makes it extraordinarily fertile in the interior of America. But what I find of interest, yes, you get the equivalent of the Gold Coast, Florida, for example, or Miami. Miami is in fact 5 million people, and the Gold Coast was actually modelled on Miami. It was actually a suburb in the Gold Coast called Miami. And then, of course, the interior around Phoenix, Arizona. At the end of the Second World War, Phoenix, Arizona had 200,000 people. Today it has 4.5 million people. The Americans have put 4.3 million people in the middle of the desert in 60 years. How can you do that? How can the Americans do it? And the biggest city we have in the interior of the Australian continent would be either Kalgoorlie or Alice Springs, around the 30,000 mark. 4.5 million versus 30,000. Well, you can do it, firstly because Phoenix, Arizona has access to the Hoover Dam. That's number one. And number two, I think the values of the American people are different. In the southwest, they actually see beauty in an adobe dwelling with a rock, cactus and scoria garden, in that southwest look. We see suburban beauty as a separate house on a separate block of land surrounded by a green lawn and verdant foliage. Our mindset is still back in Surrey 200 years ago. The Americans, so that Frank Lloyd Wright architecture, until we start to shift our values, changing the outlook for Kalgoorlie is not about creating a list and getting on the tail of the mayor and all of the politicians. It's about shifting the culture, the values, the priorities, the sense of suburban beauty, if you like, of every individual. This is not a program where you say, here is a list of things we want you to get for us. That is not the right way to look at it. Everyone at this program should walk away with, here is how I can contribute. Here is what I can do. And if we could shift our values to the extent that we actually saw suburban beauty and value in a desert lifestyle, what would that do to Kalgoorlie's future, or Alice Springs' future for that matter? The reason why you have 4.5 million people in the desert is because the Americans will play golf in the desert when they retire. We don't do desert, we do beach. We do not retire to the desert. Why not? Is that possible to shift over time? In fact, another one that I particularly like is up here. This is North Dakota, and it goes straight into the prairie provinces of Canada. North Dakota is an area of extreme and long-term population loss, not unlike the West Australian wheat belt, not unlike the Wimmera, not unlike the Mallee, not unlike the Eyre Peninsula. But these communities have turned around. There are two counties up there, one called Burleigh County, the other called Cass County. Read my column in the Australian newspaper tomorrow. This map will be there, and it'll be an argument to show how communities have turned around. And in fact, the reason why Cass County and Burleigh County have suddenly turned around is not because of any futures for them, it's because of dumb luck. Something came out of left field that they could not see, that just arrived. It's shale oil. And it is absolutely electrified North Dakota, South Dakota, and everything. In fact, in that, you could argue that the fortunes of a place like Kalgoorlie, the fortunes of a place like Burleigh County, are actually dependent upon shifts in values. All of a sudden, shale oil, or lithium, or kaolin, or nickel suddenly shift, and the value of this community shifts as a consequence. Let's take another big picture perspective and look at, in fact, world population over 100 years. Is Australia a good place to invest? The young girl that spoke so brilliantly just here, should she invest her youth, her energy, her career, her life into this community, into this country? I say absolutely. Here is the world population over 200 years. Federation to 1990 through to the end of the 21st century. Here we are at 7 billion people on the planet in 2016. This is where we're heading. This is the projection by the UN Department of Population. Best demographic brains on the planet. So I wonder what the world's going to look like up here at 9 billion people on the planet. Because I reckon at 9 billion people on the planet, there is going to be a mad scramble for food, energy, water, resources, commodities, space, security, lifestyle. What is it that Australia has to offer the rest of the world? Food, energy, resources, commodities, space, security, lifestyle. Where does the Kalgoorlie story fit within that narrative? Is it relevant? Is it more highly valued? Tick, 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 tick. Yes, I would say. Not in every box. Let's have a look at grain production, agribusiness. This is world grain production from 1960 to 2016. And that's the number of billions of tonnes. So 2.5 billion tonnes of grain is produced every year on the planet for 7 billion people. It's about 1/3 of a tonne per person, not evenly distributed, of course. Think, well, if the world population, that's grain production, so it's wheat, barley, corn, rice, whatever it is, if that's increased like that, well then, when we get to 9 billion, then surely that's got to be up here somewhere. That's all right, we'll just plant out all the unused arable land across the planet. Well, that's enough. What does that do to the value of Australia? What does it do to the value of that space? Or that space? What sort of business would you want to be in? I'd want to be in something like fertiliser. BHP Billiton, about 5 years ago, went to Saskatoon, Canada, to buy a business. What was that business? Potash. What is potash? Fertiliser. Here is big picture, high altitude demographics saying, you know, if the world's pushing in that direction, that's where we've got to be. Are we in the right space at the right time? The young girl who made that speech, yes, I say Australia. I say agribusiness, I say energy, I say commodities, I say lifestyle, I say health. All of those are businesses for us to be in. Yes, you can buy the wrong business, you can operate it incompetently, but am I in the right space at the right time offering the right product? That to me is the simplicity of business. I want to take you to China. Here are the 20 biggest cities in China. Here is the greatest market for Australian products, services, agribusiness, energy that there is ever created. We want military support from the Americans, but we want income from the Chinese. We do not expect those interests to intersect at any point in the 21st century. Good luck with that assumption. Show me a time in human history where the most powerful economy on earth has not sought to exercise that influence. I don't think that's an issue for us now, maybe not in a decade, but 2030, 2040, I think it is. Military issues would be a rising matter for Australians to be worried about, or not worried about, but concerned about, or to be engaged with. Military matters. Here they are. Shanghai has 24 million people. You could fit the entire Australian continent into Shanghai. Shanghai has added 10 million people in the last 15 years. In fact, Beijing has done that. Those two cities adding 10 million people into their middle class require food, energy, resources, commodities, space, security, lifestyle from a market like Australia. All of these, in fact, signify a direct air link with Australia in some way. And in fact, there's plenty of cities in China that have no direct air link. I see this market opening up. It's a proxy, if you like, for the rising middle class of China, in fact. Let's move it back to look at innovation. Here are the 10 biggest, most powerful companies in America. And in fact, number one is the most powerful, biggest business on earth today in our time. It is the Apple Corporation. Everyone here makes a contribution to it through your iPhone, pretty much. If you want to buy Apple, it costs $522 billion if you want to buy every share on the share market. It was formed in 1976. And then it's Google, then Microsoft, Mobil, oil, of course, Facebook, Berkshire Hathaway, Amazon.com, J&J, Johnson & Johnson, of course, General Electric, Wells Fargo. What is of interest on this scale? The thing that I find of interest on this map is, in fact, that column. It shows that the American people, the most powerful nation on earth and in history, is also the most agile. It can create 5 businesses in a single generation. It can create 1 business in the top 10 in the last decade. We are agile, aren't we? We are innovative, aren't we? We are enterprising, aren't we? That's where we're heading. The Prime Minister talks the talk, we walk the walk. How do the Australian people compare with the Americans on this measure of agility? Because that is clearly where our future lies. Here is the top 10 for Australia on the same measure in US dollars, market capitalisation. America is 12 times bigger than Australia, so the numbers are going to be smaller. Here is the top 10. And in fact, it's this column. Go down, go down, go down, go down. Oh, this is embarrassing. We talk the talk. We're good at talking about how innovative and enterprising we are and pointing to this invention and that invention. We're deluding ourselves. We do not convert it into reality. The Americans are on another planet. Say what you like about the country. They've got the runs on the board. It's like a football match. You might not like them, might not, but they've got the runs on the board. We need to shift our thinking. And if you think about this, when was the last time we identified someone as the Australian of the Year who came from the business community? When was the last time? And in fact, you can't identify someone, and that's because as a people, we remain deeply suspicious about entrepreneurial success. The Americans admire it, we cut it down. How many cricketers have been on that list? And in fact, last night there was a fantastic video shown of young kids in Kalgoorlie about what they want to be when they grow up, and one kid said he wanted to be a footballer, which is terrific. Not one of those kids said, you know, I want to start a business. Because that is not the role modelling. This is not some exercise where we create a list, where we pressure politicians to give us stuff. This is something that everyone in the room can change. If we are to run that video in 5 years' time and ask 8-year-old kids what they want to be in Kalgoorlie, I want one of those kids to say, I want to start a business. It does not occur to them. Whose responsibility is that? It's not the kids, it's us. We need to shift. If I'm making you feel uncomfortable about whose responsibility it is to change the culture, then I'm doing my job. It is not to focus on the mayor or on the members or whatever it is. Everyone needs to shift their thinking. And in fact, I think we as a people need to shift our thinking. And you might think, well, the reason why we have not had an Australian of the Year from the business community in 30 years is because there is no one worthwhile. Well, I think there is. And I think that person was overlooked. Sadly, he died about 18 months ago. I never met him. It's a guy called Paul Ramsey. In fact, he built a business called Ramsey Healthcare. Healthcare. He built it from nothing. When he died 18 months ago at the age of 73, it was in 5 countries. They saw 80 million patients per year, multiple patients in France and Australia and elsewhere. And when he died, he bequested $3.3 billion to medical research. Show me someone more worthy. He was not even considered. Look at the impact that Rosie Batty had on the Australian people over the last 12 months. She changed the thinking, the values, the priorities, the agenda, if you like, around domestic violence. What would be the impact if we could identify someone who created a business out of nothing, that pays their taxes, that is a good corporate citizen, and that acts as a role model? I don't want to be an AFL footballer, I want to start my own business. That is the culture that we've all got to create right across Australia. I think, well, where is the best community to actually create those sorts of aspirational entrepreneurial people? And you would say to be an independent, feisty type community like Kalgoorlie. Here is Kalgoorlie, 33,000 people. In fact, it's the 47th largest city on the Australian continent by current measures. At the 1954, it ranked as number 20. It's actually grown another 10,000 people in 60 years, but other towns have grown faster, mostly lifestyle towns. And I think that's the point of this chart. We are a lifestyle people. What is the lifestyle option in Kalgoorlie? Is it possible to build Kalgoorlie Boulder as a community, as a lifestyle destination? Now, I get it that rich people in Claremont and Subiaco and Peppermint Grove sell their property and then might retire to the Gold Coast or wherever it is down at Eagle Bay. Eagle Bay. Freudian slip there, isn't it? I get that, but what about Middle Australia? What about Middle Australia? Yeah, I've bought a house in Joondalup about 30 years ago. It's now worth 850,000. I'm a retired nurse or a school teacher or primary school teacher or something like that. What if I sell my house for 850,000, 900,000, buy a place in Cal? I can still go fishing, it's a good warm community, I feel safe, I feel secure, it's very sporting, quality of life, good climate. Why not? Why could we not actually pursue that as a middle class option for lifestyle and retirement? Here is the Australian continent. I showed this last night. In fact, it shows towns on the edge of the outback, or in the outback, of more than 10,000 people. So there's Kalgoorlie Boulder, that's Port Lincoln, Alice Springs, of course, up here to Broome, Port Hedland and Karratha down to Perth, Geraldton and Albany. Here is what I consider to be the natural territory of Kalgoorlie Boulder. And in fact, it is, by measure, 1/6 of the Australian continent. This is your secret weapon. It gives you an iconic status in Australia. And in fact, if you go further and look at that territory on a bigger scale, you could in fact fit France, Germany and Austria into that community. In fact, the total number of people living within that red line is 57,000. All of these little towns, as well as Kalgoorlie at 33. And Merredin, you know, that wheat-belt town that I was at about 3 years ago, is the biggest town, of course. And Kukaini, I think that's how you pronounce it, is the smallest town recognised by the Australian Bureau of Statistics at 13 people. And that was 5 years ago, so I don't know whether there's been a population boom in Kukaini or not. But anyway, you know, it's quite a significant community in the outback. The other point I'm quite eclectic. It is multicultural. This is not unusual by Australian standards, but it is unusual by world standards. So 22% of Kalgoorlie's population was born overseas, and in fact around 10% is Indigenous, a little under 10%. So Indigenous and born overseas, about a third of the population. You would actually say, go to New York, one of the great multicultural melting pots on the planet, it's barely 29%. London's 36%. Berlin, quite concerned about the influx of migrants at the moment, in fact, is around 13%. So in fact, when you look at this, the Australian people, the Australian continent, and even communities like Kalgoorlie are actually shown to be extraordinarily multicultural. We are, in fact, very absorbent and accommodating of migrant influences on a scale that you simply do not see in other nations. And in fact, in Sydney, the most multicultural big city in Australia at 42%, find me another city on the planet with more than 42% born overseas. There's only one that I can cite, and that's here, Toronto, as they pronounce it. They're all full of Americans, of course, just across the border. Sydney, Australia, even Kalgoorlie is different. Anyone who says that we are a fundamentally racist nation cannot reconcile these figures. If we are a fundamentally racist nation and people, there would be rioting on the streets at 42% of the population born overseas, in fact. I think that this is, we are eclectic, we are multicultural, and our culture has been changed as a consequence. When the Greeks, the Italians arrived here in the 1950s, we regarded their food as woke food. By the 1990s, we realised actually your food is better than our food. We started to eat out on the pavement as they did the piazza, the plaza. All of a sudden, we started to kiss each other on the cheek. This is a continental affectation that we have absorbed over time. We have a fusion culture. All of a sudden, we sort of regarded them as wog food, and now we see social cachet in showing how eclectic and cosmopolitan we are. Who had heard of quinoa 5 years ago? But we're all saying, "I'll have the quinoa salad, thank you very much." Quinoa is actually an Arabic grain. We are a plastic, pliable, absorbent, accommodating, welcoming people by any measure, by the fact of these figures. And I think that gives us a cultural strength. And I would say, sure, the numbers, 57,000 people controlling a space of the Australian continent the size of Germany, France and Austria, gives this community an independence, a strength, if you like, that is not replicated anywhere in Australia or elsewhere. Let's take this further. Look at the Kalgoorlie population. The largest ethnic group are actually the New Zealanders. The New Zealanders are everywhere. You could be living next to a New Zealander and you wouldn't even know it. They blend into the population. Love the New Zealanders. Then the Brits, 10-pound poms that arrived here in the 1950s, of course. The South, very Anglo community, you would say. Filipinos, Zimbabweans, of course, Indians. These are about 5 or 6 years ago. There's a new census later this year. But again, I see this as a very eclectic, mixed community. It is no different to any other community. I can go to a place called Horsham in the Wimmera. 20,000 people, 10% of the population was born overseas. Even in the most white-bread communities like the Wimmera, 10% born overseas. Go to Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, 750,000 people, 4% born overseas. We are fundamentally different to other places on earth, and accommodating is what I would say. Here is Kalgoorlie Boulder over the last 10 years. Over the last 10 years, Kalgoorlie has gone from 30,000 to 33,000, about 3,000 people added over the last decade. And in fact, you can see, there's about 200 extra kids over that time frame in net terms. A lot more people in their 20s, I suppose, manning the pumps in the mines, the mining boom, and all of these sort of baby boomers up here in their 50s and their 60s. Fascinating. That's the last 10 years. What happens over the next 10 years? We're talking about the future of Kalgoorlie Boulder. Here's over the next 10 years, it's a little softer in its rate of growth, and here is the insight. The growth is going to be in primary school and secondary school. Do you have enough primary school and secondary school facilities? If not, you need to actually be planning for them over that time frame. Sports would be a business to be in over the next decade. And all those 20-somethings that came in for the mines leave, but then some stay and move into their 30s and 40s. What do 30s and 40s want in Kalgoorlie over the next decade? They want affordable housing. And affordable housing, to me, I'm from Melbourne, you can buy a 3-bedroom brick veneer home on the western suburbs of Melbourne for $370,000. I think it starts at about low fours in Kalgoorlie. But I still think that that's relatively affordable compared to, say, Sydney, where housing affordability starts at around $550 up at Kellyville. The other thing up here is that the baby boomers are going to start moving into their 60s and early 70s. Hips and knees replacements would be a good business to be in Kalgoorlie. Volunteering as a social movement. There is a lot of goodwill from baby boomers. The time in life where you're most likely to volunteer is in your early 60s. So you come out of the workforce, you don't want to retire entirely, so you volunteer. Can we set up volunteering programs, perhaps facilitated through the council, where people make a contribution? It's not just about commercial activity, it's energy, it's social cohesion that we need to leverage into this community. And then, of course, in their 60s, travel is very, very important. I don't know whether you've noticed advertisements in the newspapers over the last 2 years on Saturday mornings, particularly for what I call Rhine River cruises. And baby boomers compete with each other about which cruise they've been on. So again, that would be something to watch. The next chart is benchmarking Kalgoorlie with other cities and towns of a similar scale. And this is my point about Kalgoorlie punching above its weight. It might only be 33,000 people, but it's almost like the capital city of a de facto region, a de facto country the size of part of Europe. So Geraldton has 40,000 people on the coast. It actually doesn't have a daily newspaper. I had to check this with my PA 2 days ago. It only comes out 2 or 3 times a week. Warrnambool does not have a local television facility, local stories, for example. Kalgoorlie Boulder, University campus, capital city air connection. Could be better, I agree. Local TV, yes, you get reporting locally. Daily television, daily paper, and local radio. Mount Gambier, around about little smaller. It's only Kalgoorlie Boulder that has all of those ticks. As a fact, this community punches well above its weight, is my point. Here are some examples of towns across Australia where I have seen a sudden shift, uplift in populations over the last 20 years or so. And in fact, the best one I can point to is Invercargill in New Zealand. Invercargill is a town of 50,000 people at the bottom of the South Island in New Zealand. It's on a latitude that's 500 kilometres south of Hobart. It's really cold down there. And for 30 or 40 years, it had been slowly losing population. It was regarded as the end of the earth in New Zealand. And then, about 15 years ago, the local CEO to the local council had a brainwave. Her name was Jenny Simmons, and I noticed a sudden shift in the demographics of Invercargill. I rang them up and they told me the story of what Jenny did. She worked with the local community to make access to the polytechnic, the local university, fee-free. And all of a sudden, 2,000 kids arrived not interstate, but from other parts of New Zealand into that town. The impact on Invercargill was absolutely electrifying. And the point was made to me that when you have depopulation like this, old people retreat inside the houses. There's a feeling of doom and gloom. All of a sudden, you've got 2,000 18 to 19-year-olds into the town. And I was down there at a conference and they said it was unbelievable. In a month, the place changed. And the most noticeable thing was, 18 and 19-year-olds would be walking down the street in public, holding hands and kissing. We have never seen people do that. Public displays of youthful affection. When you take that out of a community, the rest of the community just slowly stultifies. Put that energy, that eclecticism, that youth into the community, and all of a sudden old people started coming out of their houses. It's like the glue that actually drives the community. You need demographic articulation, is the point. And all those red bits up in North Dakota and South Dakota and the Wimmera and the Mallee, the same principle applies. How can we inject or retain youth is absolutely critical into this. Public housing in Wyala, the land giveaway, never really successful. There's several examples across Australia. Bruce Rock in the wheat belt over here was another example several years ago. Griffith new crops, and it's not the crops that you might be thinking about. In the 1990s, Griffith went through the roof because McDonald's contract for gherkins were concentrated in Griffith, and there was this guy who made a fortune in gherkins in Griffith. Echuca is the Sigrid effect. This is my theory that every place where the actress Sigrid Thornton screens a mini-series like All the Rivers Run out of Echuca. Echuca blossomed as a consequence. Sea Change was focused on Barwon Heads in Victoria. Barwon Heads went through the roof. So if you really want to kick Kalgoorlie on, you need to entice Sigrid Thornton to come to Cal to set up a mini-series and make it desirable. Harley Bay is Wales, of course. Karratha, different projects. There's a town outside Geelong called Bannockburn. I live in the Western District. I'm in Melbourne, and I cut through the back of Geelong, through this godforsaken place called Bannockburn for years. And then about 10 years ago, Bannockburn just absolutely ignited into action. And it was around tree change, lifestyle blocks, people commuting into Geelong. Nimbin, of course, which was the great baby boomer shift in the early 1970s up in the Northern Rivers. Roxby Downs, Katherine, of course, is the military base, the Air Force base, and Junee, in the middle of the Riverina. Here is a town of 5,000 people that had not changed for 20 years, up to about 15 years ago. And in 1 year, it's about 1998, the population jumped by 10%. 500 people had just arrived in Junee. I was so excited about finding a new driver of population growth in Junee that I rang the council straight away and said, do you realise that your population jumped by 10% after 20 years of doing nothing? What has happened? And the local economic officer said, oh, that's probably the new prison. And I said, how many people are in the prison? He said, oh, about 500. So a prison can actually do this as well. The other point is that you do get regional knocks in Australia. And in fact, if you look at Wollongong, the Port Kembla Steelworks once employed 23,000 people. In about 1986 to 1987, it went to 14,000 and then to 7,000. It's about 5,000 today. The impact on Wollongong was absolutely brutal, but the population did not change. So you can have a diminution of the workforce, but it actually takes 2 or 3 years for it to drop. Geelong, of course, I lived in Geelong for about 10 years, still have friends there, very close to the town. And over the last 12 months, Ford with 2,000 workers, Alcoa with 1,000 workers, Shell with 750 workers, all closed. I will also say that from 2008, Geelong has transformed itself. In 2008, the Transport Accident Commission was relocated from Exhibition Street in Melbourne to Geelong, 750 workers. That was followed by Victorian Work Cover Authority, relocated to Geelong. That was followed by the National Disability Insurance Scheme headquarters, gifted to Geelong 2 years ago. And the Australian Bureau of Statistics relocated 250 white-collar workers from Belconnen to Geelong. All of this has happened in 7 years. Is it a coincidence that Geelong is also the headquarters of the most marginal electorate on the Australian continent? The electorate of Corangamite is held by a whisker, in fact. So electoral balance is very important. And Newcastle reinvented itself after 3,000 jobs were lost in the BHP steel rolling mill in 1999. I was there at the time, and Newcastle people were absolutely devastated about what that might mean for the community. And in fact, Newcastle today is in a better position than it was back at that time. Townsville was the same. Here is where the jobs are. We have lost 359,000 jobs as a nation over the last 15 years. We've created 3.5 million. It's a net growth of 3 million jobs, mostly in knowledge work. And that should be the emphasis for any future strategy for Kalgoorlie. I won't go through that. Here is what I think any sizable regional town needs in order to be successful. You've got a lot, but there's a couple of things here that I think we need to be focusing on. Tertiary education campus, yes, you have that, tick and tick. Local television production, media, newspaper, your sense of independence, a sense of your ownness, if you like. In Geelong, there is no local television. You're just an outer part of Melbourne. You've lost the identity, the separate identity. Geographic command over a distinct and resource-rich region. The Kingdom of Kalgoorlie. Toowoomba does it to the Darling Downs. That's a good example. as well. So tick, 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 got all of those covered. Access to diverse lifestyle options. Sea change, street change, suburbia, inner city. I think this is an issue. It's a monoculture. You need cultural diversity in a community. That is something we perhaps need to work on. Access to affordable housing. Affordable housing by Australian standards has a 3 in front of it. And I'm not quite sure that you're there. I think it's low 4s. So it might be just a touch up on where it should be. Expandable infrastructure like water, power, sewerage, roads. That again might be an issue in this area. And a critical mass of population. And even though it's only 33,000, here is a community that certainly has garnered a lot of services well above, and also an entrepreneurial spirit, a galvanised community. I was in Broome 3 years ago, and a magnificent community, fantastic community, very cosmopolitan community, but it was hopelessly divided over the James Price Point issue. If there is one thing, one strategic asset, it's not about having universities or whatever, it is having a galvanised community. It's easier for politicians to go into bat for you if they know you have their back covered. The problem in Broome was, well, I was told, look, if I make this decision, I'm dead. If I make that decision, I'm dead. And that leads to stealthification. So a galvanised community. The community that I have seen and experienced that I think is the best in this regard is the town of Dubbo. 40,000 people live in Dubbo. Go to Dubbo, and there are 40,000 people that are, yay, go Dubbo. A galvanised community led by inspired leaders actually deliver that spirit. And just finally, I want to introduce you to a new concept that I have done. I have scanned every suburb, every neighbourhood, every precinct, every village across the greater kingdom of Kalgoorlie in order to find, I'll get to it just in a moment, Kalgoorlie's bachelor hotspot. Where is the highest concentration of eligible young bachelors in the broader Kalgoorlie region? And by young, I mean 25 to 35, 5 years either side of prime marriageable age, and single, separated, widowed, never married or divorced. These boys are on the market. Where is the highest concentration of eligible young bachelors relative to eligible young women? I've run the numbers, and the highest concentration is to be found in the suburb of Somerville, in fact, 2.24 eligible young bachelors per eligible young male, female. Clearly the Somerville pub on a Friday night is the place to be. I have in fact done this analysis for every major city in Australia, including my hometown of Melbourne, and the highest concentration of eligible young bachelors in Melbourne is to be found in the suburb of West Footscray. And I have been told that the odds might be good, but the goods are odd. I would never say that about Somerville. You can in fact do exactly the same analysis for eligible young women. And of course the hotspot right across the kingdom of Kalgoorlie is to be found in Esperance, in fact. Technically, the census says there is 1.25 single women aged 25 to 34 per single male in that community. Of course, Somerville is linked to Esperance by the Coolgardie-Esperance Highway, which I think should be renamed the Highway of Love. Bring together the boys of Somerville with the girls of Esperance. Thank you very much.
So we've got our one project, Highway of Love, let's all go home. All right, so we have actually run out of time to ask questions of Bernard, but if anyone's got an absolutely burning one, otherwise we are picking up stuff on Sligo, and Bernard is going to be here at lunchtime, so I'm happy for you to also have a chat with him over lunch. Has anyone got an absolutely outstanding question you need to ask? No? Fantastic. Well done. Great team. Well done. Thanks very much, Bernard. Thank you for that presentation. That was sensational.